And let's be clear, when you say what we do, you mean not what we're doing here at home, but the policies abroad.
The Islamic, if there's any more insular society than the American society, it's Muslim society. They don't much care what goes on in our country. And in fact, to the extent that they know what's going on, they admire it. The ability of Americans to feed their kids and educate them, find housing, find work, speak their minds. All the polling shows that's admired in the Muslim world. We have an inability to believe, for some reason, that Muslims can make a distinction between Americans and their government. My travels in the Middle East, I think you could ask any intelligence officer, any military officer who traveled in the Middle East, they are invariably welcomed by Muslims. Muslims like Americans. The discussion around the dinner table when they have you to dinner always turns to why is your government supporting Mubarak who's torturing Muslims. But as people, we're not hated. And yet our politicians continue to tell Americans that the Muslim world intends to wipe you out, to force you to convert, to make your daughters wear burqas to grammar school. And that's just nonsense. And it doesn't hurt anyone, sir, but us, because we underestimate the threat of the enemy.
What are the threats that we should be worried about? You talk about that in your book.
I think we should be very worried about an enemy we can't deter. We have spent hundreds of billions of dollars since 9/11. The government in June, through the National Intelligence Estimate, says we haven't beaten Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda is stronger than it used to be, and it has more allies. The threat to America, look at our borders. We have let the discussion of border control and immigration control evolve into a discussion of refugee rights and human rights. Well, if we have an enemy we can't deter, and we have open borders, how in the world are we ever going to expect our law enforcement to protect us in this country? But it's another issue that our politicians won't take on. America needs immigrants. My grandparents were immigrants. But there's no reason people can't come in an orderly manner so we can protect ourselves. But the politicians are courting the Hispanic vote, they're courting the free traders, they're the business community who wants cheap labor. None of that protects America.
One of the criticisms that I think one can make against your book and your ideas is
there are probably many, sir.
Yeah, well, let's talk about one, and that is that America is really, at this point in time, probably still the most important global power. And with that global power comes global responsibility and global interests. And some of those interests are manifested through the constraints that are put on us by things like international law, the requirements of international trade, rules about warfare, and so on. So some of this that you sort of associate with kind of do-good values that demonstrate that our leaders have sold out the nation and the national interest. Talk a little about that, because to be fair to our leaders, they're caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, the narrow national interests that a middle great power like France or Britain would have, versus those set of interests that a global power has, but the additional ones of global responsibility.
You can be a global power without being an interventionist power. There are things that occur on this earth that may distress us, may upset us, but ultimately have no impact on American interests. What I would argue is that we continue to plod down the road as if we still live in the Cold War era. The Cold War was really a period of extraordinary peace in the world and prosperity. It was a dangerous, terrible situation, but once the Soviets acquired nuclear weapons, there was a standoff, and there was a certain amount of peace. The rules of the Cold War don't apply anymore in all instances. We're certainly not, for example, we don't have the bottomless pit of goodwill that we had during the Cold War. When we were condemning the Soviets and fighting the Soviets, anybody in the Western community could see that, well, the Americans might be pushy and they might be bossy, but at the end of the day, do we want the Red Army in the neighborhood? The answer was no. We're more or less we're much more alone than we used to be. And we're much more, in my mind, we're much more threatened than we were during the Cold War. This is an enemy, as I said, we can't deter. This is an enemy which we are motivating, and we haven't recognized that yet, or we haven't accepted that. And I personally think that it's a excuse to say, well, we have international agreements, we have this, we have that. We don't have anything unless your country survives. And no country has a right to survive. No, it's not in the Ten Commandments. It's not given by God. You survive if you can. And I think America has to begin to realize that it is a vulnerable country. You know, just take energy. People always fall back when you talk about energy to say, well, it's a fungible commodity, let the market take care of it. Well, we as Americans have frittered away our freedom of making a decision between peace and war on energy. If something happens, not only in the Muslim world, but if something happens in the Gulf of Guinea that stops production, we will go to war to restore it. So I think, you know, there's certainly leftover international regulations, international ideas that you have to cope with. But I think we've lost the idea that the first job of American politicians is not to be citizens of the world, but to be citizens of America.
So I noticed you thanked Pat Buchanan at the beginning of your book. I mean, is that where you come down, or are you not that nationalistic where you take an extreme position about where we should be in the world? Because as I listen to you, you seem to be more moderate than you seem to be in some places in your book.
I think Pat Buchanan had it exactly correct when he said that isolationism is not a philosophy, it's a slur. Americans, since the founding, have created and governed a nation that has been fully involved in the world in terms of commerce and finance, in business, in education, in science. We have never been an isolationist country. We have been a non-interventionist country at our best. But I think that what I am, first of all, is a nationalist. I think it's important to the world, but it's important to America to survive as a viable entity. That our first duty is to ourselves, not to build walls around America, but to make sure that we do the best we can for the American people before we look abroad. No one, least of all me, says we can build a fortress America. You can't do it. But you can pick and choose the issues you need to become involved in.